In present-day numbers, Islam is the second largest religion in the world. There are more Muslims than Protestants. There are more Muslims than Catholics. There are more Muslims than Hindus and Buddhists put together. According to Pew's Global Religious Landscape Report, there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. That comes out to around 23% of the population of the world. Thus, almost 1 out of 4 people in the world is a Muslim. In America, we often associate Islam with the Middle East and with Arabs in particular, but only about 18% of Muslims in the world are ethnic Arabs, that is, peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. What's the biggest Islamic country? That is, the country with the highest number of Islamic citizens? It isn't anywhere in the Middle East. It's the island nation of Indonesia, here in Southeast Asia. Indonesia has 209 million Muslims. The second biggest nation in absolute numbers of Muslims is India, which has 176 million. That's only around 14% of the population, but still, that's a lot of people. The third and fourth place nations, Bangladesh and Pakistan, are also in Southeast Asia. According to the Pew Research Center's Global Religious Landscape, December 2012, this is how Muslims are distributed across the world. North America has 3.5 million. Latin America and the Caribbean, 0.8 million. Europe, 43.5 million. The Middle East and North Africa, 317 million. Sub-Saharan Africa, 248 million. Asia and the Pacific, 986 million. One thing you can observe about this map is a vast difference between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. There's a big east-west difference here. Here's another way to cut up the data. Asia and the Pacific has almost 2/3 of the world's Muslims. Europe, 3%. The Middle East and North Africa, 20%. North America, 0.2%. Sub-Saharan Africa, 16%. Latin America and Caribbean, 0.1%. If you ask where are the majority Muslim countries, that's what we see here. Islam started about right here and quickly spread out this way and this way and this way. And the countries that are majority Muslim still reflect those early expansions. Where did the religion of Islam come from? According to non-Islamic historians, it goes back to the 7th century Common Era, to the ministry of a prophet named Muhammad. According to traditional Islamic teaching, Islam goes back to Adam, to the first man, the first human that God created. In their view, Islam was the primal monotheism, the original monotheism of the human race, and other religions have resulted from the corruption and loss of this primal monotheism. Now, it's indisputable that in some sense Islam began with Muhammad. When they say that Islam goes back to the first man and the first woman, they're using the word Islam to mean just submission to God. And if that's what Islam is, then there's been Islam as long as humans have been submitting to God. Of course, that's not what historians of religions mean by Islam. They mean the religious tradition that was founded by Muhammad in the 600s CE. You've probably heard of the God of Islam, Allah. Allah is just the Arabic word for God. Before Muhammad came around, Arabic-speaking Christians worshipped the one God by this name. Still today, there are some Arabic-speaking Christians who worship God, and they call God Allah. Allah is the exact equivalent of the Greek term hatheos, literally the God. When you see God in the Christian New Testament with a capital G, it's hatheos in Greek, the God. Allah is how you'd translate that into Arabic. Many Christians strenuously argue that Allah is not their God, that there are clearly two different gods here. Well, without getting into philosophical issues, it is surely true that traditional Christianity and Islam disagree about the one God. Whether they're talking about two different beings altogether is another matter. In the view of Islam, the tradition founded by Muhammad is just a purification and a fulfillment of Judaism and of Christianity. Historians believe that before Muhammad's ministry, Allah was worshipped at the Kaaba shrine in Mecca, although without an idol. They think he was considered the traditional highest god of the Arabian Pantheon. The Arab tribes had a traditional pantheon, much like the Indians, or the Egyptians, or the Greeks, or the Romans. A complex collection of gods, some with family relationships to one another. This pantheon is thought to have included 3 daughters of Allah, named Manat, Al-Usa, and Alat. Those three daughters and dozens of other deities were worshipped with idols and with animal and grain sacrifices at the Kaaba shrine and elsewhere. But again, according to Islam, Allah is the same one God that the Jews and Christians had talked about earlier. Allah is just the God of Abraham. What does the Quran say about Abraham? In the Quran, Abraham is said to be perhaps the greatest prophet prior to Muhammad, and his son through the slave girl Hagar, that is Ishmael, or in Islam Ismail, is mentioned also as a prophet. The Bible, you'll recall, doesn't say very much about Ishmael as an adult. He kind of just lives happily ever after. But a later Jewish book, called the Book of Jubilees, asserts that the Arabs, the tribes inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula, are really Ishmael's descendants, and it calls those people Ishmaelites. And in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, many Christians and Jews believed this. They also called the Arabs Saracens, which was sometimes explained as deriving from the word Sarah, Abraham's wife, and the word in Greek kene, meaning empty or barren. The name then would mean that Sarah is barren. It was because Sarah was barren, that is, unable to conceive, that Abraham had a son through the slave girl Hagar. Strangely, the Quran shows no awareness of this idea that Ishmael was the ancestor of the Arabs, nor does the Quran anywhere mention Sarah or Hagar. But these connections were made by medieval Muslim historians. These historians also tried to explain how it could be that Abraham and Ishmael rebuilt the Kaaba shrine in Mecca, as the Quran asserts. It says that Ishmael grew up in Mecca, and that it was Abraham himself who instituted the Hajj, the important Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. Another place that Abraham appears in the Quran is when the Quran gives its own shorter version of the events of Genesis 22. Oddly, the son that's almost sacrificed is not named. Commentators have wondered if it's supposed to be Isaac or Ishmael. Abraham gets the command to make the sacrifice in a dream, and the son himself encourages Abraham to obey the command. But before they even start to carry out, it seems that God tells them that it was all a test. In our next segment, the life and ministry of Muhammad.